very interesting lecture, sort of. I appreciate that you all are here. I'm Tristán. I am a PhD candidate here at the Department of Religion Studies. I am currently in my third year, and Charlotte has been gracious enough to invite me to entertain you guys. So firstly, allow me to start with a little joke of mine. What did the Satanist call his sailboat? Sail Hanta.
What?
Okay, so as you see, as per the slide, I've inserted one of my favorite quotes. Let me just make it like that. So one of my favorite quotes is this from Voltaire, or the philosopher François-Marie Arouet, which said, Monsieur l'abbé, je déteste ce que vous écrivez, mais je donnerai ma vie pour que vous puissiez continuer à écrire. Which basically translates to, was a letter that he wrote to an abbot, where he said that, Mr. Abbot, I might not agree with what you write, but I will fight for your right to write it. So this is me. I am the Friendly Satanist. That is my brand. I'm active on all social media platforms, mostly trying to loosen the grip on people's prejudices on Satanism, as well as minority religious rights in South Africa. So I'm a research associate and PhD candidate here at the Department of Religion Studies, and I'm also an executive member and community paralegal at the South African Pagan Rights Alliance, which is a non-profit company that basically fights for minority religious rights in South Africa and the representation thereof. I'm also a social media influencer, as I said, at the Friendly Satanist, and a secular spirituality consultant at a private practice where I basically provide counseling to individuals from a secular and objective perspective. And my private practice is called Alterity Counseling, which comes from the Latin alter, or different. And in general, I am also a minority or indigenous religions or new religious movements and spiritualities advocate, because I find that in South Africa, we find ourselves in a polemical context where essentially Christianity is dominating the discourse presently. And I find that, you know, there's not enough awareness in society about other religious faiths. So I want you to ask, or to consider the following. One should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedom of another is to forgo one's own. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. People are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. Now, what do you think when you read these statements? Quickly, just your initial thoughts. Yes.
Okay, well for me, because I know a little bit about it, I know it's part of the ways of the Satanic Temple.
Correct, yes. It's definitely the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple. But before I ask that, how many of you have thought that Satanism is about slaughtering cats and worshipping the devil and lighting candles and all of that, you know, doing weird stuff with cloaks? Yeah, exactly. Midnight orgies and stuff like that. So yeah, that is not Satanism. This is the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple, the 7 fundamental tenets. The Satanic Temple is, of course, an organization in the United States, one of 2 organizations that mainly represent Satanism. The one is the Church of Satan, which is a more of an older organization that started with Anton LaVey in the late 60s, with the occult revival in the United States. And then the Satanic Temple was a breakaway from the Church of Satan, and the Satanic Temple was created as a sort of a spiritualistic organization to take the fundamental rights of religious organizations and religious rights and use them in a way to combat the Christo-normative oppression in, for example, the US, to, for example, fight for bodily autonomy, abortion rights, and stuff like that. So, who and what is Satan then? So we've all heard the concept of Satan. We all know that some of you who have a Christian background have been thought that Satan is the epitome of all evil. So for centuries, the dominant Christian moral narrative has labeled Satan the personification of all evil. And subsequently, those who thought differently and whose ideas perhaps threatened the social reality of the church along with it, from the heretics of the 12th century to the witches in the 16th century. This is, unfortunately, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Satan has always been portrayed as the epitome of all evil that seduces humanity into iniquity or sin. And this can be seen in, for example, the Hansi Cronje incident, which happened in the early 2000s, where he, for example, fixed a cricket match. And then afterwards, he colluded with a prominent pastor called Ray McCauley, and then created a sort of quasi-narrative of that, the devil made me do it. And, you know, essentially, that was his narrative. And we also know another good example of that, or of the Satan being blamed for all humanity's iniquity, is, for example, found in the Devil's Dorp or Krugersdorp series, where the Electus per Deus cult was commonly portrayed as Cecilia Stein being a 36th generational witch or something, and Satanists were pursuing her and therefore justifying what she did in the appointment murders. So the morphological origins of the word Satan is interesting. So usually when we try to define an ideology, I personally like to go to the ancient languages and see where this term derives. So the term Satan comes from the Hebrew word Satan. Obviously, Charlotte might know more about this than I would, seeing as though she's got more Hebrew expertise than I have. But depending on the context of its usage, it could either be used as a verb, translating to bearing a grudge, cherish animosity, or oppose. As you can see in Psalms 36 verse 21 and 71 verse 37, and the rest you can see there. Or a noun, translating as opposer, opponent, adversary, or enemy, or even accuser. Without the definite article ha, which translates to the, this or that, it could refer to any human being or supernatural entity. And in the ancient Near East, the concept known as Satan was commonly referred to someone that did not conform to the social or cultural narrative or the ideology of the day. Only 3 texts in the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the 3 texts called by the Old Testament, is only where the definite article is exclusively used when mentioning Satan as a heavenly prosecutor. So Satan is essentially portrayed as this accuser in Yahweh's heavenly court, where he challenges Yahweh and essentially is portrayed as the de facto opposer to Yahweh against the tyrannical authoritarianism of Yahweh, which can be perceivably seen in the narratology of the Old Testament. So the events recorded in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 2, 1 Chronicles 21 are echoed by 2 Samuel 24. However, 2 Samuel 24 is an older manuscript, but makes no mention of Satan, which is interesting. So in the Greek New Testament, you get a different interpretation, which is somewhat similar to the Old Testament interpretation of the word Satan, but then you've got or Satanas, or Satan, which is also present in the New Testament tradition. In the Gospels, Jesus is often encountered conversing with the enemy, who tests him frequently, where Jesus was in the desert. Also, in the event of inexplicable illnesses and the occurrence of alien or abnormal behavioral phenomena, Satan is held responsible. So Jesus in the desert can simply be interpreted as him being terrorized by his own ego, which the Satan iconography in essence represents in Satanism as that part of your ego which is in essence suppressed. And the other part, of course, where Satan is blamed for inexplicable phenomena, where that guy in the, I think it was the graveyard, where he was seemingly possessed by demons, which can in a modern sense be interpreted as a mental health issue, which he basically is suffering from, and the antiquitous narrative or approach thereto was to obviously blame Satan, because obviously we blame things that we don't understand on a supernatural evil. Even evil spirits, or as I said, mental health issues, are attributed to the Satan figure, We've seen a lot of this in olden days where people didn't really understand mental health, and when someone had a convulsion or they had a panic attack or an anxiety attack, they would be exorcised because of the fact that people thought they were demonically possessed. So the late Second Temple period in the New Testament textual traditions exemplify a well-established socio-theological concept of evil personified in Satan. Satan was a latecomer, although, to the theological developments of monotheistic Yahwism in the Old Testament and the early theology of the New Testament. So basically saying that the concept of Satan did not feature in the original roots of monotheistic Yahwism, which we know today as Judaism. And Satan is not unique or Christian, but a compilation of diverse social, historical, and cultural thought in the ancient Near East. So Satan was, in essence, a plagiarized concept from other religious traditions that were much older than Christianity and Judaism, which we'll get to in a moment. Scholars remain unanimous in their assertions that the cosmological dualism, evil versus good, that gave birth to the enigma of Satan as personification of evil in the pre-Christian era already started to manifest around circa 550 to 330 BCE, during the late Persian or Achaemenid era. The Persian dominance in the ancient Near East from circa 539 BCE onwards had significant impact on early Yahwistic theology, and it contributed to a plethora of expressions that would later find its way into the Hebrew Tanakh. The Achaemenids were Zoroastrians, which is in essence the oldest monotheistic religion which we know of to this date, and according to royal inscriptions, known as the Diva inscriptions. So the Judeo-Christian conceptualization of Satan was strongly influenced by the Zoroastrian concept of Angra Mainyu, the polar opposite to Ahura Mazda in the Zoroastrian faith. So Ahura Mazda was the god of light and fire, whereas the Angra Mainyu was the god of evil and darkness. After the Emperor Xerxes came into power, religious freedom in Persia became less free after the Diva inscription, and therefore scholars speculate that the key Sumerian word Diva equals demons, or the modern conceptualization of demons, which in Greek is daimonion, and thus implying that Xerxes considered other deities as evil or demonic, therefore implying that there is already a sort of a movement that, permeated the demonization of other faiths that did not agree with the de facto religious belief system. So Satan is essentially, as I said earlier, in the New Testament, characterized as being God's adversary and the ruler of a kingdom of darkness, which is borrowed from Greco-Roman mythology of Hades and Orcus. So the interesting thing as well is to just go back to the cosmological dualism. The cosmological dualism in essence originated within classical Greek philosophy, whereas there was a discrepancy between the self and the spirituality, which is today known as asceticism, which is also present in the Bible, where individuals were taught to deny the ego or the flesh towards the pursuit of the spirit or the spiritual. And through the dichotomy of that concept of spiritual and bodiliness, that idea obviously conflated with a sort of cosmological dualism, good and evil, and the ego or the self was seen as spiritual, the self was seen as evil according to the moralists in early Greek philosophy. So Satan is a plagiarized social morality of Christian thought used by the Romans to vilify indigenous pagan religions. So when the Roman emperor came into power, I think it was Emperor Constantine, there was a constant focus towards the Roman Empire conflating itself with the Christian theology so as to remain dominant in in Israel, so as to not ostracize the Israelites and basically gain dominance over them. If you can't beat them, join them. And that is in essence where 90% of the Christian theology surrounding Satan came from, and as well as the iconography surrounding Satan. The fork, the pointy tail, the horns, and everything was essentially a conflation of ancient pagan deities, which was a very clever way of using propaganda to force the indigenous tribes of the pagans to conflate and to conform to the Christian de facto theology. Satanism and the occult scare. Now, we all know that during the early 80s to 90s there was the Satanic Panic. Many countries ranging from the US, the UK, Australia, and even late apartheid South Africa were gripped by a moral panic, and widespread rumors of SRA, or satanic ritualistic abuse, often also referred to as occult ritual abuse, started to spread. This was influenced or propagated by media and film entertainment, where narratives of occult ritual abuse stories introducing cases of sexual abuse and or murder of children as a part of devil worship. For example, Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground, a live 2-hour documentary by Geraldo Rivera, was gaining prominence during that time, and it was actually one of the most viewed television documentaries during that time. It earned the highest ratings at the NBC and remains one of the most watched documentaries in TV history, which is quite interesting. Despite these baseless allegations and pseudo-investigations, false investigations, the main driving force was the Christian right. And of course, the Christian right can be seen as the main dominant influences behind apartheid. Though these conspiracy theories tracing back to Smith and Pads's publication Michelle Remembers gained massive attention across various media platforms, scholarly consensus again is that there are, that these allegations are ritualized, or of ritualized form of abuse, are socially constructed, are in essence false. And you can see this in prominent publications by Kenneth V. Lanning, which was a special agent for the FBI, and Jeffrey S. Victor, who was a theologian and psychologist. And Waterhouse was a media or journalist who did her PhD thesis on the media narrative surrounding these occult spread media things. And of course, Daniel Dunbar and Swart obviously refers to Satanism and the satanic occult and panic scare connected to the convergence from South Africa out of apartheid. And so the Afrikaner had the scare of, now we are being exposed to things that are foreign, and these are in essence satanic. So it was caused by a generalized paranoia in the face of moral panic and other external social, economic, and political threats to social order after apartheid. So then it comes to the term occult. So the term occult is an unhelpfully broad umbrella term for a lot of left-hand path philosophies. So in certain religious scientific discourses, you've got a distinguishing between the right-hand path and the left-hand path. The left-hand path is similarly referred to as occult philosophies or non-hegemonic traditions, which are frowned upon in certain circles. And the right-hand path obviously refers to the main dominant traditions, which are, for example, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. As I said, it was an unhelpfully umbrella term which encompasses knowledge about a plethora of non-hegemonic spiritual, transgressive, supernatural, and paranormal beliefs and practices, many of which are considered perverse, ephemeral, or childish. It is also worth mentioning that the occult deals mainly with the esoteric realm, specifically that of Western esotericism, but it is not exclusive to Western esotericism. Things like, for example, sangomas and ancestral worship, as well as traditional medicine and traditional healing and shamanism, can all be considered occult. But I'm obviously, yes?
Sorry, can you please tell us what esoteric realm is? I've never heard that term before.
So esoteric refers to the term esoterikos, which comes from the Greek and mainly refers to inner or self-knowledge. Yes. So Masaeli defines esotericism as a preoccupation with hidden or secret knowledge pertaining to the innermost spiritual consciousness, uncovered through the exploration of mystical, transpersonal, and speculative perspectives and expressions about belief. So, but there is obviously a very big scholarly discourse and discrepancy on the definition of that term, because some of them believe, like for example, Hendrik Hanegraaff, who is a scholar of Western esotericism at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, believes that, esotericism should rather be or understood as something which pertains to traditional and rather, non-explored belief systems, and believes that Masaeli's definitions, which are echoed by other scholars, makes the field more marginalized than it already is. So Kilcher also in contrast adds that expecting a de facto universal definition is problematic and difficult for esotericism and the occult. So esotericism is basically just another term or reference to the occult. So it is displayed in the vast diversity of its textual corpus and traditions, ranging from but not limited to gnosis, which obviously refers to Gnosticism or knowledge, and magic, or to theosophy and New Age. Theosophy, for those of you who don't know, was a philosophy created by Helena Blavatsky in the early 18th or late 18th century. And discourse concerning esotericism has only developed into an academic discipline in its own right within the last 10 to 15 years. So it's a very, very new discourse. So this is because contemporary scholarship largely abandoned the initial late 18th century French conceptualization of esotericism, characterized around the Greek esoterikos or esoteros, meaning inner, inside, or interior, from the root esur, an older form of the word esur, which means inwards or in, loosely meaning in, within, or inside. Later translated into the Latin occultus and combined with the Greek formula, forming a Neo-Latin term, esotericus, interpreted within this context as pertaining to knowledge which is hidden, secret, or inaccessible, or only accessible to initiates. Esotericism has evolved beyond this simplification and is now considered by contemporary 20th century scholarship as a worldview finding its roots in natural philosophy, religious and literary traditions. It's far removed from being regarded as something marginal, exotic or obscure. Esotericism, Satanism, the occult and Crowley. Magic leads us to exhilaration and ecstasy, into insight and understanding, into changing ourselves and the world in which we participate. Through magic we may come to explore the possibilities of freedom. Crowley has had an indisputable influence on the Western esoteric discourse and the occult. Now, I don't know, for you don't know who Crowley is. Aleister Crowley was also an 18th century occultist who had, was very controversial in his explorations. He was also the creator of a society called the Ordo Templi Orientalis, which was an esoteric philosophy or an esoteric cult per se, that dealt with gnosis or knowledge and pursued different traditions which were again considered ephemeral or childish or even evil to gain self-knowledge. And it was very, unpopular, of course, back in the day. His work has significantly impacted the formulation and development of not only esotericism, but also new religious movements. Modern Satanism as a religious philosophy centers around the philosophical and ideological approaches to Satan as a symbol for free thought and self-determination. So again, we don't worship Satan. The founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, did not overtly connect or credit the origins of his ideologies to Crowley, but there is a very, very distinct connotation or connection to his conceptualizations of especially magic to Crowleyan thought, which obviously considered magic to be a religious or spiritual practice concerning the sacred practices of, religious traditions. Identical to Crowley's Thelema in his introductory work, Magic in Theory and Practice, especially considering its emphasis on indulgence, rebellion against blind faith, and his employment of the Enochian keys. So the Enochian keys was also a form of language developed by two occultists, John Dee and I can't remember the other guy, but they were two mathematicians in the Victorian era who developed the Enochian keys as a sort of esoteric language to communicate with angels per se. And the Enochian keys were a system of angelic conversations developed by Victorian occultist and mathematician John Dee. Later deciphered by other contributors, eventually transformed Dee's legacy into a ritualistic methodology for the invocation of entities. In Satanic as well as Crowleyan magic and theology, those entities are considered metaphorical or latent powers into the emotional states within the psyche or your mind. These unique practices and religious cosmologies are collectively assimilated within the philosophy of the left-hand path. Also known Post-Theism and Satanism. So also known as non-theism, post-theism is a word used by philosophers to describe a society that no longer believes in God. It sees belief in God as a stage of human development that is not necessary for the 21st century or contemporary society anymore. And it argues that we should jettison the concept of theistic faith back to primordial antiquity and seek new approaches of spirituality in the contemporary society we find ourselves in. In a post-theistic society, the God of the Bible would be viewed on the same level as the mythological gods of old. Nietzsche is a very good example of this, who wrote in his philosophy, The Parable of the Madman, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, which is obviously a lamentation to society, but not necessarily an implication of that we have killed a God, per se. Satanism rejects the belief in supernatural entities or phenomena. We pursue Enlightenment ideals and promoting secularist values, scientific reason and rationalism, opposing and advocating against oppressive religious practices. For example, in the US you will find the Christian church putting monuments on certain public property and making that property exclusively Christian per se, and the Satanic Temple basically encourages not just themselves but other faiths to put, religious iconographies and monuments on the same property to promote religious equality. And another example is, for example, the gun violence in the United States, where a lot of the Christian fundamentalists consider it a right, a biblical right to carry a gun, which obviously causes the church shootings and stuff like that. So that militant aspect of Christianity is what Satanism in essence tries to compete with, and in essence use the religious rights that we have to combat these oppressive ideologies and fighting for human rights equality and religious equality overall. So one can also consider Satanism as an embodiment of spirituality that stems from later schisms of transgressive practices in Buddhism, in utilizing one's consciousness towards self-actualization, also known in some Eastern esoteric philosophies as the higher self, but it is independent of a god or gods. Therefore, it connotes to a sort of an atheistic or post-theistic spirituality. It can also be considered as a term that my dad invented as conscious acceleration, constantly improving oneself through critical self-reflection and rebellion against injustice via aesthetic terrorism, using things to accelerate your own conscious growth as a sort of introspection and forcing yourself to reconsider yourself and your ideals continuously. Shocking people into paying attention and to critical thinking and realization of their own individual freedom, thereby systematically helping facilitate society into a post-theistic era by exemplifying that you are your own God and therefore able to create and destroy your own reality. As the great Christopher Hitchens said in an argument once, show me one thing that God can do that I cannot do. The future of post-theistic spirituality lies within you. Spirituality needn't be theocentric or centered around a god, but anthropocentric, meaning centered around you as a human being. It is better and more rewarding and empowering to be spiritual or sacred about one's own existence and life. Spirituality is a form of lived religion. Crackford and Ostrom argue that lived religion is very much different from the way it is described and understood in textual corpus. While some religions encourage strong adherence to scriptures, others completely reject the idea. Even when religions are policed and correct belief is assured, individuals still practically improvise on their beliefs in ways which might objectively be considered in violation of their theological correctness. So why not live theologically incorrect in a world which demands theological correctness as opposed to worshipping an ancient war god of Canaanite origins who suddenly became multiplicitous and thus polytheistic after the first century. Live theologically incorrect by being true to yourself and your own desires and ideas. There's absolutely nothing wrong with pursuing a spiritual praxis which not only encourages you to be free within your own self and pursue a life which not only encourages you to be free from oppressive ideologies but allows you to be more compassionate towards all creatures in accordance with your own reasoning. So these are just a few references from which the slides come from. I'll obviously, if you're interested, you can get the slides via email. 8 minutes. Okay, perfect. So you can obviously then get these references and the slides, and you can obviously read my publications on the matter and my PhD thesis, which is about esotericism as a whole. So yeah, that's the end. Any questions?
Before they ask questions, do you know the UK rights on being live while they're asking questions?
No, not familiar.
Rather let's finish the live.
Cool.
And then